This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Bridey Thelen-Heidel is an author, teacher, and TEDx speaker from Lake Tahoe, California. Her memoir, Bright Eyes: Surviving Our Monsters and Learning to Live Without Them, was released in September of this year and is about the indomitable spirit of a young girl forced to be brave, required to be resilient, and conditioned to be optimistic, and how she ultimately uses the same traits that helped her survive her mother's chaos to create her own happily ever after. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Bridey.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate it.
I'm happy to have you here, Bridey, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Well, technically for this book, it begins 5 years ago when I finally took all the stories that I had been putting together, probably since a kid, since I was writing in my diary and then in journals, all those stories that I wasn't really allowed to tell anybody, and the stories that I was trying to make sense of for myself. And so I wrote them down and tucked them away, and got to my mid 40s and realized, like, if I was ever going to write this book that I had been thinking about and that my friends had been telling me to write, as a lot of people, I'm sure can relate, I better start. So 5 years ago, I ended up meeting the band Duran Duran, who I had wanted to meet for a very long time. And it turned out that was going to make a really cool component to this book. And so after I met them, I started writing the book the next day.
Well, I mean, as a child of the 80s that I am, I have to ask, how did you come to meet Duran Duran?
Yeah. Well, they are a pretty significant part of my story. There was some trauma bonding, really, with their music when I was in middle school, as I'm sure, again, a lot of people can relate to. You just find songs that you resonate with, you cry to, you write poetry to, sad songs, whatever. And I found this band when I was 12 and I was hooked. And as I went through my adolescence, and we moved about every 6 months, sometimes I didn't have much time to pack, but I always made sure I brought my records. And so I'd stuff them between two pillows, throw them in a black trash bag, and take them to the next place. And when I got into my 20s and I was teaching and into my early 30s, I realized that their music really meant more than just being a fan. And I teach high school English, and I had shown my students this great documentary by this young director at the time, Brian Herzlinger, and it was called My Date with Drew. And Brian had given himself 30 days to meet Drew Barrymore. It's an adorable documentary. And my students said it was kind of a goal-setting exercise for them. And they said, you should do that with Duran Duran. You should meet them. And so it took 15 years. It took my whole community really rallying around me. It took a very failed attempt publicly on the Ellen DeGeneres show. But then I ended up, there was an article in South Tahoe Now, and my whole community retweeted it to the band, and they were coming to Tahoe for a show. And they finally just kind of gave in. And they said, fine, we'll meet you. We'll meet you. And so I got to go meet them, as specifically Simon Le Bon, the lead singer. And then when I was backstage, he said, I think I should take you on stage. There's a lot of people in that audience who probably would like to see us together. And I said, well, if you insist. And so there it goes. But for anybody who's a fan of Duran Duran, well worth the wait. They are the nicest, most wonderful people, and I couldn't say enough about the whole experience. It was great.
What was the song or the songs that really spoke to you when you were in middle school?
Well, the first song I heard was The Reflex. It was like 1984. MTV had only been out, a few years. And The Reflex came on, and I was living in Juneau, Alaska, pretty far removed from pop culture anyway. And that song was it, right? That song and that video that was so iconic. And
That
then,
had
of
the
course,
waterfall coming out of the scene,
yes,
right? Yeah.
right. Russell Mulcahy, yeah, he did that video, and the girl was crying. It was oh so dramatic and wonderful. And so then I went back and got some of their older records and some of their sappier stuff, of course, that I could cry to and write in my journal too.
That's an awesome story. So, I have to ask, why were you moving around so much every 6 months or so?
Yeah. So my mom was probably the world's worst decision maker, and she had a bad picker, as they say, for men. And so, when I was a kid, I wasn't completely sure why we moved a lot. I changed schools as I counted writing the book 22 times before I graduated from high school. And it seemed like as I was writing the book, I figured out that they coincided with running away from one man who I call monsters in the book, or, you know, meeting a new one. And then they would take us away from family that might have protected us. And yeah, so just when maybe a neighbor would have gotten the sense that something was going on, or a teacher, we would move.
Interesting. And were the men move with you, or were you moving away from them as well?
Sometimes she would bring them with us. We were in Alaska when I was young, and then we migrated to South Lake Tahoe, California, where I live now. And so she would bring them with us, and sometimes we would run away from them. It just depended on the situation. So, um, yeah, it was often in the middle of the night. It was always without much warning. So I didn't usually get to say goodbye to my friends or say goodbye to teachers. I have one memory of having enough time to actually have a goodbye party in the eighth grade, but otherwise it was always rushed, and always much of the time in secret too. Yeah.
How did that impact your ability to form relationships with other people as you entered your adult life?
Well, I think for some reason when I was a kid, I got very good at kind of collecting people. And as I would leave, I always got addresses. So I had an address book I carried with me for years. And I was a very good pen pal. And I think I realized that if I didn't keep connections with these people, nobody would keep connections with me. And, that was a time when you didn't obviously have a cell phone, and it was too expensive to call people. So I wrote a lot of letters. And as I got older, I just really made I made a lot of effort in my relationships with people. And I still, I was just sharing with you that I went on this book tour for the book. And it was very cool because at every stop, somebody showed up who I had seen since I was 12. There were friends of mine from middle school who showed up, and friends who I hadn't seen since college, 30 years ago. And so I think that was what I did. Um, is just collect people. And now I have this really amazing kind of network of people all over. So that's exciting, especially for the book. It's really exciting.
Yeah. So I am sure what's not as exciting is, the circumstances that led to you writing this book and having this, kind of book come out of you. And it sounds like you had a lot of encouragement from people in your life to get this story out. I'm curious, what was that writing process like for you? Kind of taking, the trip back and putting it all on paper.
Well, I think any memoir writer would definitely agree that it's very, very hard to go back and exercise up and out stories that you've hidden away for a very long time. And I think in my case, when they finally came out, when I finally decided to tell the stories, they came very, very quickly. I had buried them pretty deep, and what had developed CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which has become a little bit more well-known in the last few years with Stephanie Foo's What My Bones Know, The Body Keeps Score. There's a lot of books out right now about that. And I was incredibly sick. And an acupuncturist who I went to asked at one point, did you go through any trauma as a kid? And I was like, well, how much time do you have? Yes. And he said, well, these are things that you probably need to deal with and face and maybe start writing them down. And so when I did decide to sit down and write the book 5 years ago, it came out so fast and faster than I could write, faster than I could type. So sometimes I would just get on Google Doc and hit the microphone and I would just speak it. And then, of course, go back and edit or delete, sometimes very dramatically, print pages just to burn them, But they came out very, very fast. They were ready to come out. And then there's, of course, as a writer, there's a long process of drafting and figuring out what you're going to leave in and what stories to tell and what not to tell. And while I had people encouraging me, which was amazing, I also had people who are very upset I've written this book. And that's also a risk you take as somebody who is telling truths that really need to come out. So my family has gotten smaller since this book started, for sure.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that, but before I do, I'm curious about this notion of you kind of holding all of this in for so many years and then that turning into illness inside your body. And that's something I've heard a lot, where you take the traumas that you've had in life. If you don't have an outlet for them, if you don't address them, they will turn into something that could physically harm you. What were you experiencing?
It's interesting because I held it all together in my 20s and I did not go no contact with my mom until I was 31. And by 33, I was almost dead. So it was like my body held it together. And then once it realized maybe the adrenaline stopped, or maybe just my body realized it could start to kind of turn inward and take care of itself, it just unearthed all this illness. So I had my gallbladder shut down. By that time, my gums, I had a very advanced kind of periodontal disease that can, I think, be caused from stress. I had a lot going on in my uterus. I just had my esophagus was torn up from old ulcers. So it was really bad. And I was a very healthy person. I ate well. I didn't drink a lot. I exercised. And so I was just looking around like, why am I so sick? And once I realized that there might be other things to do in addition to good food and medicine and doctor care, right? I did all those things. It was multifaceted healing. But I started to heal myself and I started to heal all of the stories and the trauma. And that was kind of the focus. I did a TEDx last year called Rob the Trauma, Steal Back Your Life. And that was really about the healing that I went through and how I addressed all of these issues and healed my body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The you mentioned that your family's gotten smaller, and it does take a tremendous amount of vulnerability to write a memoir, because I mean you yourself are somewhat of a public figure. You're a teacher, so there's a group of people right there who are going to learn a lot about you, and of course their families might learn a lot about you. So it does take a tremendous amount of vulnerability to put that down. I'm curious as to what your family and those, who you were previously closer with, felt about it.
Yeah, I think obviously the people who I identify as the monsters in the book, I haven't spoken to those people in decades. So I'm sure they're not happy about the book, but I don't care. Um, I think, though, what is happening is people related to them are upset that I am talking about, their fathers. I'm talking about their mother, talking about, a friend they know. And I think what's important to know, and I've talked to some other women who've published with She Writes Press, which is my publisher, about this topic, that we held on to those secrets for so long and they controlled the first 30 years of my life. And I just couldn't let those secrets and those people control the last part of my life too. And if I was going to wait until they were all dead to tell the stories, that might be too long for me to write my own story. And so, memoirists, we always put a nice disclaimer at the beginning that it's my truth. And I appreciate that other people don't see the perspective I had. I was a little kid in a lot of this, but whatever that perspective was is what I grew up with, and it's what I believed, and it's what shaped me. So if it's wrong for somebody else, it's still what my body has known for my whole life. So that is my truth, and I told it to the best of my ability. And I wrote this book in present tense also. So I'm telling it as I'm seeing it and observing it. And that also took a lot of judgment out of it. So you as the reader get to judge what I'm going through, because I'm little and I can't really judge it until I get a little bit older. But it is hard. It's not been easy. And there have been book events and there have been things where people are expressing that they're upset, but I'm upset too. I know it's hard for them to read, but it was certainly hard for me to live. And so at some point, I had to decide that this story was going to come out not only to heal me, but also to heal my sister, one of my sisters who I dedicate the book to. It's been very healing for her. And then to heal other people who have this shared experience, which I've found at every turn. So for every message that I'm getting where somebody's upset, I'm getting 50 messages of people who had a similar childhood or who know someone who, and, I'm 53, and I think that we're a generation that just didn't talk about these things. And we didn't go to therapy, and we kept it and we held it all together. And we're very proud of that, right? We see all these memes and funny videos of Gen X and how tough we were. And, we were 30 at 12. Like we were the oldest 12-year-olds you ever saw. And so I do feel like telling this story is telling a lot of people's stories. And it's just been really encouraging. People have told me that I'm helping them to start writing, and I've inspired them to pick the pen back up or to get back in that, journal that they were looking at years ago and had put down. And so I feel like that's all worth it. That makes the vulnerability worth it, and it is not easy for my town to know all of this about me. I've worked very hard to have a certain reputation as a teacher, um, and I'm very positive, and to have people know my secrets, and to know stuff that is raw and scary and just not great has been hard. But that's the price, and I hope that it helps more than it hurts.
Well, I know that is the price, but do you feel like in a way you're relieved that you're not holding a secret anymore?
Oh, 100%. I do. Because again, it's giving other people permission to talk. And I, again, I think as a memoir writer, you're always cautioned not to write a tale of revenge. And I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I just set out to tell this story and to talk about how resilient kids are and how brave we become when we are forced to. And as a teacher, I have watched kids like me for 30 years in my teaching career, 25 years. And so I think it's extremely important to tell the story. And I think it's really important to not be afraid of the truth, because that means that I'm ashamed of it. And I am not ashamed of it. It's just hard. It's just hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How therapeutic was the writing process for you? I mean, I assume you did a lot of work on yourself before putting pen to paper 5 years ago, but as part of sort of your healing process, how therapeutic was the writing of this memoir?
Think when you write your story down, one thing that happened for me is it relieved my body of having to hold all these people accountable, because what happened for me was I would hang on to these triggers. And so if I heard a certain sound, I would remember something that happened and I would hold that person accountable. And I would think of all the things they did and why they're wrong. If I smelled something, if I smelled, in my case, ground beef cooking, or if I smelled taboo perfume, there were just all these triggers that I had held on to because I was going to hold the adults accountable for what they had done 50 years ago, 45 years ago. And so as I wrote them down, they became stories. And every draft took it that much farther away from me. And so while they were still personal, as I wrote them and draft after draft, and I spent hundreds of hours on chapters. This was not 3 drafts. I mean, somebody who's writing, just know that I think it takes, if you're doing it in a way that just really feels like it can actually be out there in the world, it's hundreds of hours for a chapter. But the more I did it, the more I was distanced from it also. And that was incredibly healing. But, I would write and I would walk out in the living room and climb in my husband's lap and cry. I would go outside and I'd yell at the trees. I'd go for a run. There was a lot of process to this, and it was very cathartic though. And I feel like such a gift I gave to myself, and daunting to think about starting over. I'm not going to lie. Like if you told me to start this book tomorrow, I'd be like, wow, because I was writing it during the pandemic. In order to write it, I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning because I teach at 7, and I had to write it until midnight sometimes and 12 hours on the weekend. So it was a lot, but I do think it was absolutely the most therapeutic thing I've ever done for myself. A lot of self-love for sure.
So after putting in, those thousands of hours on the manuscript, talk to me a little bit about, having it go from manuscript to book. Manuscript is something that someone's buying. What was that like for you?
So I pitched a lot of agents and had this dream of getting an agent back east at the big five, the big five publishing houses. And agents were actually quite nice, the ones who responded and said, love your writing, but you're not famous enough. I can't represent you, which is, I'm sure you've heard that from a lot of writers. And so
and agents.
I didn't know really what to do. Yeah, and agents, exactly. So I ended up stumbling across She Writes Press, which is a hybrid publisher who's got a lot of great credibility, and they vet manuscripts. And so I think they take 30% maybe of the manuscripts they get. I'm not quite sure, but I met Brooke Warner at the San Francisco Writers Conference, and I was like, what is this hybrid publishing? This was a couple of years ago. I had never heard of it. And it ended up, they accepted my manuscript with the understanding that it would go through several more drafts and copy edits. And so in hybrid publishing, just for people who aren't super familiar with it, what I did is it's definitely a hybrid between self-publishing and traditional. So I paid for the printing of my book. I paid She Writes for the help with proofreading and designing the cover. And so I got to participate in that process as a self-published author would, but then they take it and they do all of the things that traditional publisher does. They actually, turn it into a book, and they do the ISBN and the copyright. And then they do all this amazing distribution, and they partnered with Simon & Schuster. So lo and behold, I'm a hybrid published author with a traditional distributor. So Simon & Schuster has got me all over the country, which is like a dream come true, really. But yeah, I've invested my own money to print it for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that model, I do believe, is a model of the future because, and I have heard it from agents left and right, after the very humbling querying process,
Yeah.
where they say, your social media is not enough. You don't have enough followers. You need more of a platform. And of course, it's so hard to build all of that stuff when you are, somebody who works a, 7 to 8 job or something like that, or
Right.
yeah, so there's a catch-22 there. It's like lightning literally has to strike for you to get the attention of one of the big, agents to get into one of the big publishing houses.
Well, yeah, and I had actually come across some writers who they did have agents, but then agents couldn't sell their book.
Yeah, that
And so now they're sitting on your book for 2 years. And I thought, well, I'm 53. I don't have, or at that time I was, 51. I'm like, I don't have all this time. I want to get it done. And so even though once I signed a contract with She Writes, it was going to be another year and a half, that was so fast compared to other people I knew. Because I couldn't imagine waiting to get an agent, finally getting one, and then they sit on it because a publisher won't take your book or an editor. So I do feel like, if people go with a hybrid, just vet it carefully and make sure that you're getting your money's worth, and make sure you have somebody who is credible in the field. And, a plug for She Writes is I adore them, and they publish women and a lot of memoir and fiction, but it's worked out great. And to have Simon and Schuster, are you kidding? I'm like, it's amazing. It's great.
Well, I'm curious, if you could go back in time and whisper some words of advice into, the younger Bridey, who was like picking up at, after dark and leaving town, to start over again, who went through 22 schools, before graduating.
Mhm.
What words of advice would you give your younger self?
You can't fix her. I would say that to little Bridey about my mom. You can't fix her. Get out now. Hurry up. Leave and start your life. Because, I did leave my life. I did leave and start my life. I went to college and I broke away, but as a kid who was pretty addicted to rescuing her mom, and then I became the rescuer of my little sisters, it's a very hard relationship. It's a hard habit to break, as the song goes, but it's tough because that codependency is real, and it's founded in love, and it's grounded in love. But I wish I would have had the strength to put myself first a decade earlier. And so when I finally did go no contact at 31, it still wasn't totally for myself. It was because I had a little girl and I didn't want my mom to affect her life. So I wish we had the strength to choose ourselves and not to feel like we are selfish or self-centered. And I actually write about that in the epilogue of the book, that leaving is hard and staying is hard. And you will be told that you're selfish and self-centered. But I was told all these things and I was called all these names, but I was never called back. So when I finally left, nobody called and said, come home. And nobody called and apologized. And nobody called to ask why I left. And because they all knew. So, had I done that a decade earlier, I mean, as it all works out, life is great, and I have the life I have. But I would have loved my own TED Talk at 17, and I would have loved the advice to sever ties a lot sooner than I did.
Yeah. What do you think would have
Yeah.
been the biggest difference in your life had you severed ties 10 years earlier?
Well, I would have probably not gotten so sick, for sure. I could have started healing earlier. And, I mean, it is hard, I guess, when you make choices, because I wouldn't have met my husband and I wouldn't have had my daughter and teaching. And I think everything falls into place. But I do think that putting myself last all the time, which is, I think, what we do because we think we're supposed to, and it's somehow honorable and righteous to do so. It's just so destructive to us, physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And as a teacher, I have the opportunity really to tell my students. I teach freshmen and I teach seniors, but my seniors right now, I have an opportunity to help them to kind of see, like, you can rewrite the story you've been written into, right? You can make your own choices if you're not feeling like you can, and just try to empower them a little bit, without, I'm not trying to, have them rebel against their families or something, but it's just to give them a sense that they can trust themselves, I think, a lot earlier than we tend to do.
Yeah. How did you come up with the title Bright Eyes?
So that was a nickname given to me by my mom. And I had originally wanted to use my mom's name, but that's not allowed. It's using somebody's real name when you're not speaking nicely about them. So I decided that Bright Eyes would be a better title because it was a nickname, and sometimes it was used in a sweet way, and then it later became something that wasn't used so kindly. But I also thought, just as an English teacher, always looking at symbols and metaphor and all that, I thought it was just representative of who I am as a person. I'm very optimistic and tend to see the good in things and tend to see positive outcomes. So I thought Bright Eyes was kind of explained all of that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, ever since I read that title, the song Total Eclipse of the Heart has been playing in my head. So I want to thank you for that and getting the reflex stuck in my head as well.
Yes, thank you. Welcome. Both good songs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Bridey, where can people pick up a copy of Bright Eyes: Surviving Our Monsters and Learning to Live Without Them?
You can pick it up anywhere you buy books. So certainly bookshop.org, Amazon, Simon & Schuster's got some links, and Barnes & Noble. A lot of local Barnes & Noble will have it. A lot of indie bookstores are carrying it. And if it's not at your indie bookstore, they'll get it for you. So that's always the great first stop, right? To support our little bookstores because they need us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and get your friends and have a little book club, and I'll zoom in and answer your questions because you're probably going to have a few.
Well, if people did want to do that, how can they get in touch with you? Are there places they can follow you in social media?
Sure. So I have a website, BrideyThelen-Heidel.com. I'm also on Facebook as Bright Eyes Author and on Instagram as Bright Eyes Author as well. Yeah.
Very good. I will put all of that in the show notes so people can find you easily, Bridey. And I want to thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.